Good day, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 5, Psychology of Stress. We've talked about what stress is, what stressors are, good stress or eustress, neutral stress, and bad stress like distress. We've talked about how our society causes us stress and sociology of stress, and what happens to our body when we have stress, how it reacts with hormones to prep our bodies to handle and deal with that stress. And today we're going to talk about how our mind and body perceives our mind perceives stress so we can manage it. There are many theories that attempt to explain the psychological nature of stress and how we attempt to deal with and the problems that we face. And these theories are based on the many aspects of psychology, including personality, emotional responses, perceptions, and a wide range of human behaviors. To thine own self be true. This is very helpful as we try to figure out the psychology of stress, to be truthful with yourself about how you feel and just how you really think about things, because then we can actually apply what we're talking about to our daily lives. As we have begun to realize that the body and the mind are connected, thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and personality traits come from our mind. And sometimes some of these affect our body in the regards of stress. Because of this, we realize that the mind is very complex and more than a byproduct of neurochemical interactions. Out of all of this came the field of psychology. So again, we're going to be looking at how the mind perceives stress so that we can figure out how to deal with it and look at some specific aspects of psychology of stress. Not one psychologist seems to have a complete explanation on how the mind and stress work together, but together we can start to see the whole picture as we look at several theories. Freud thought that our mind operates in three different ways, with the id, ego, and superego. The id is the instinctual need to have immediate pleasure, not thinking long-term about how it might affect anything or even if it's right. It just wants pleasure now. So for an infant, they have an innate desire to be fed, to feel comfortable, to not be sitting in a dirty diaper, and to have some affection. So when it comes to adults, he talks about our innate desire for pleasure, like from sexual desire. You don't have to think about it, it's just there, and you're unconscious. The superego, this is the rational one. This is where we get our thoughts about what's right and wrong, what's culturally acceptable, thoughts from religion about what's right and wrong. It's like the little angel sitting on our shoulder trying to tell you what is right. The superego thinks about long-term effects and how it will be helpful or not. The ego plays the mediator and tries to figure out and decides what action to take. The ego can delay gratification if it's going to result in pleasure later. We don't actually have an id, ego, or superego. It's just an analogy to help explain the thought process. So the purpose of the ego is to protect us against any threat, to increase our pleasure and to decrease our pain. So as far as a threat, just a little one, let's just say you're driving on the road and someone who is behind you is driving kind of aggressively and they're riding your bumper and it's kind of concerning you a little bit. So your ego wants to decrease any pain or stress that might be causing you. So say you decide to pull over and let that car pass you. Here's something a little more subtle. So you're going to the grocery store to pick up some dinner items. You're trying to decide what to eat. And you want Mexican food, but you think that will flare up your ulcer. That would cause you pain. And we want to decrease pain, so you decide to get something else. So what happens when we're in a disagreement with somebody? You're upset with them or they're upset with you. That causes us pain or stress. So what does the ego want to do? It wants to increase the pleasure. So instead of not talking about it, the ego would want to talk about it, get to know the other side of the story and resolve the conflict so we can increase our pleasure with that relationship. And Freud believes that there's always tension in all of us, as the ego is responsible for controlling the impulses from the id and realizing what we should really do. He also thought that we protect ourselves, our thoughts and our feelings about things with defense mechanisms to either increase pain, like to protect ourselves from criticism, not to have someone mad at us or not being mad at ourselves, or to increase pleasure, to be in good standing with someone and not be stressed. And we do this unconsciously. We don't really devise a plan, we just think it or blurt it out. And we do these things to eliminate stress. Okay, so let me give you a small example, personal example. So I was talking to my husband the other day, and I said that every time I get off the ramp to go on to 81, there always seems to be a semi right there, and while I'm trying to merge, so I have to pull over and stop and wait for traffic to open up, and it's just very frustrating. And he said, yeah, you really need to be going about a good 70, 75 out the end of the ramp to merge into traffic successfully. And for some reason, my mind thought that this was a stressor or a threat to me. And in all actuality, he was just trying to help me. But the way I perceived it was that he thought that I was doing something incorrectly and he needed to tell me how to fix it. And I thought that I perceived that as a stress. So my reaction was, oh yeah, I mean, I know, I just have to get better at that. And, and I didn't really need to react that way. I could have just taken his information and said, yeah, you're right. But that defense mechanism flared up, and it is that little. Every time we find ourselves defending ourselves on these little things, we have perceived what the person has said as a threat. And I actually have kind of turned it into a game. Both of us have. When you're in conversations with people, we use defense mechanisms a lot. And a lot of times they're unnecessary. So after our conversation or disagreement or whatever it is, more times than not, one of us will say, sorry about that. I just had some defense mechanisms flaring up, and I didn't need to do that. I hear what you're saying. That was very helpful information, and then we move on with our conversation. So it's very little, but try and figure out when you're talking with people and notice when you have defense mechanisms happen. Overprotection can be as bad as underprotection here. Think about that as we go over the list of defense mechanisms next. So if you're going overboard with defending yourselves, you can really put yourself in a bad position. People know what you're doing, and they see you as not being truthful or trustworthy. On the other side, underprotection is when you're in situations where you're not standing up for yourself at all, and that's not good either. All right, so let's go through some of these. So first we have denial. That's when people are confronted with a situation that they find to be a threat, and they often deny association or involvement with it. Children do this when they're caught in doing something they shouldn't. Adults deny drinking or gambling problems or cheating. Anything that is perceived to be a threat to one's identity can make a person deny involvement or any knowledge about it. And like I say to my children, denial is a fancy word for lying. And then repression. This is an involuntary removal of a painful experience in your mind. It's not suppression where we purposefully push it aside. These are things that cause emotional discomfort and pain, and you can't seem to recall the details about it even if someone tells you what you did. And then we have projection. This is when we defend ourselves by projecting how we feel onto others. We get mad about something, and instead of sorting it out for ourselves, we get mad at someone else. So say we oversleep and we're late to work. And then we complain about how bad everyone else's driving is making you late. I was late because I was stuck behind this big truck. Then we have displacement. This is a transference of emotional pain, usually anger, from a threatening source like the boss that you just can't stand, and you take that out on something that's non-threatening like an animal. Then rationalization. This is a manipulation of the truth to make things seem not so bad. So say you did something that was really stupid, and you think it over in your mind and you try to minimize the actions that you did, making it try to not seem so bad. And then we have humor. And this is the way for the body to release repressed thoughts through laughter. Do you know anyone who, when they get mad or they're upset or stressed, they actually laugh? This is another defense mechanism. Sometimes it is difficult to deal with reality, and this is why we do these things, these defense mechanisms sometimes. And if we can get past that, we can realize that dealing with the situation can actually give you less stress without the defense mechanisms. Let me just give you a little example. So I was starting this new job, and I could realize that there was this slight tone of that some employees were not owning up to things that were their fault. Not big things like the mail was in the wrong place, the files were out of order. So one day we were all in the main office, and the secretary got upset. Who did this? Whatever it was. And then the other employees started to chime in and bicker about it. And I had been through enough situations at this point to know that I just needed to claim it and move on. And it was easier for me because I didn't have to keep track of what I said or So I just said, oh, that was me. I'm sorry I did that. I thought that's where it goes. And these three ladies in the office were so shocked. They just stared at me. They were shocked that I owned up to it. And they saw that I was sincere, and so they had nothing else to gripe about. I told them I would do things differently next time, and then I was off the hook. Facing it was actually a better defense mechanism, so to speak, than if I had actually used one. And then it started to become like a game to me, honestly. They were always so surprised that I was truthful or honest and apologized that I actually enjoyed seeing them be so surprised, so I started doing it more often. I think people expect us sometimes to use to defend ourselves more often than not, because I think naturally we tend to do that. And it's surprising when someone doesn't. In all actuality, we want people to not use defense mechanisms because it makes interactions so complicated when people do. Carl Jung is another famous physician who used the metaphor of an iceberg to explain our minds. So what's the deal with the iceberg? The part of the iceberg that we see on top of the water is only a small part of a larger piece of ice that's underwater. And he believes that our minds are like an iceberg with 3 different layers, with the majority of the mind underwater or unconscious. So the conscious mind focuses on specific thoughts. What should I have for dinner? When will this PowerPoint be over? What am I going to be getting for lunch? The unconscious mind is a storage area for thoughts, ideas, concepts, and images that the mind doesn't have room for, as well as repressed thoughts. And the collective unconscious was some sort of reservoir for ancient myths and memories that we all carry deep in our subconscious, which historically repeat themselves in forms of stories and people. He thought that the unconscious part of our brain spoke a different language than our conscious mind, and this is why we often don't understand our dreams, and that sometimes they seem to be all over the place. But he put a lot of importance on trying to figure out what they meant so we can release this unconscious stress. So he always wanted people to try and interpret their dreams so we could resolve and get to the bottom of the stress that we're feeling. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with the stages of grieving the death of a loved one, and the death or grieving of any unmet expectation is stressful and relates to this theory. Here are the stages of the grieving process anytime that we are grieving the loss of something. It doesn't necessarily need to be a person. It could be the loss of a job, a relationship, a dream of something that you thought was going to happen. And we all seem to go through these stages as we process things. Sometimes it takes us months on one of these stages before we go on to the next one. Sometimes it's much shorter than that. So first we have denial. This is the refusal to accept the truth of what has happened. And then there's anger. This is the physical expression of emotional feelings like yelling, pounding, crying, or even deep frustration. Bargaining. This is brief but important. It's an agreement with the conscious mind and the soul involving an exchange of offerings. Like, I will do this if I can just have depression, a quiet or passive mood of uneasiness while feeling overwhelmed with thoughts and responsibilities at the same time, with little, if any, perceived hope. Then there's acceptance. If a person moves through various stages, then they can get to the acceptance or an approval of existing conditions. They are receptive to the fact that things can't change. And this is not giving up, but it's just allowing you to move on with your life. Very little examples. Okay, I failed a class. I'll take it again. I'll do better. I'll improve my GPA. How about when we lose our wallet? Okay, I can get new cards. I can buy a new wallet. This only happens if we learn to adapt our thoughts and our actions. And again, to just mention, research shows that we go through these stages not only with death, but the loss of anything that's significant, a relationship, something monetary, a possession, or even a job. Going through the grief cycle really does take time. It's not an instantaneous thing. I had a good friend of mine who got married, and 3 months, he was very happy. 3 months later, his new bride said to him, I don't want to be married anymore, and filed for divorce. And he was just distraught. When we were talking about it, he said, you know what, I tried to go through the grief cycle really quickly so I could move on with my life, and I realized I did not spend enough time doing this, and now I find myself going through these grief cycles all over again, or these stages all over again. So this does take time.